My name's Stuart Morris. I'm the Director of Birmingham Holistic Health Centre. I've been running the stress management course with Lorna for about 3 years. Experience-wise, well, I've been into the holistic therapies about 30 years, trained in all kinds of therapies, aromatherapy and reflexology and NLP and hypnotherapy, but there was a missing point in all the courses that I'd done, and which was addressing stress management in a holistic approach. So we wrote this up and we submitted it to the Guild about 4 years ago, and they asked us to break it up and put it into smaller components. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to keep it intact as an holistic approach, and so we tweaked it slightly and resubmitted it to the Complementary Medical Association, and they snapped it up. And then from there we resubmitted it to the Guild, and they snapped it up. So it's endorsed by 2 different governing bodies. It's a really, really good course. It's an in-depth course over 4 days. And now what we've decided to do, because there's a need for it, is to adapt it and make it to our online course. And so you're going to get abbreviations of each of the 6 steps, which we'll talk about a bit more later on. So I'd suffered myself with anxiety for over 10 years. I was on 160 milligrams of beta blockers, and nothing really changed, nothing made a difference. So the things that we've learnt, and I've learnt over the years, we're going to introduce you to on the online course, and they make a huge difference. So we hope you get on with it, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, then please drop us a line. If you want to do the 4-day course, then again drop us a line. And what we'll do for you is we'll discount what you paid today for the online course onto the main course. So let's see how you go. So we're going to introduce you to the 6 steps, which is very much an holistic approach to health. And so the first step we're going to look at is what is stress. In a minute I'm going to show you a little stress bucket and give you the definition, our interpretation of how stress affects you. So on the questionnaires that you're going to have on handouts all online, they're going to ask you this simple question: what is stress and how does it affect you? And then what we do is we follow the lead from nature. We just put that to one side, and then we show you techniques how to calm the mind. So there are lots of different breathing exercises that we can show you, but we're going to show you perhaps 2 or 3 online that you can adapt and bring into your life. So once we've calmed the mind down, we start to again look at what's bothering you, what's the stress, and then we're going to say, well, what is it that you want? Because everyone's an expert in what they don't want. So we're going to find out exactly what it is that you want, and then we're going to give you techniques and skills in which to reach whatever goal it is that you want. And then normally there's going to be blocks for each and every one of us that stop us reaching those goals. So we're going to show you different techniques adapted from things like NLP, hypnotherapy, emotional freedom technique to remove those blocks. And then we're going to show you online again different ways of supporting the body with the right herb, the right nutrients, hydration, a lot more other things. These are all the simple steps that you're going to go through. And each one of these steps create movement, which is the idea of the course really, because when you're stressed, you're stuck. And so very, very systematically, we're just going to begin to introduce you to movement in the mind and the body. And then the last bit, we're going to introduce you to a healing philosophy. Is there such a thing as a healing philosophy? There is, because the way you adapt and the way you think about life makes a huge difference. So that's the very simple analogy of the 6 steps that we're going to go through. It's all broken down very simply, very easily, and you're going to have MP3s and audios that support all of these simple steps, and you'll have all the handouts, and you can just tick each one off you go through. And the beauty of this is you can go through at your own pace, come back to it at your own time, whenever you feel the need. And really the idea is that you adapt some of these things, incorporate into your own life, and little by little, I can promise you one thing, you'll get movement, and movement means change. Okay, so I'm going to go through this part, explaining to you what stress is and how it affects you. So we've got a little analogy here of a little bucket. So imagine the brain as a bucket, just like this. And what tends to happen is people's problems get stored in the bucket. So for me, it might be worrying about finances, worrying about the business, worrying about my daughter, worrying about my son, so forth and so forth. In fact, Every single one of us will have something in this bucket, and every single one of us, although generally we overlap, every single one of us will be different. And in fact, some people's buckets from very, very early on tend to be even somewhat full. And then what tends to happen is life does its thing, brings a lot of stress to your door, and little by little by little, the bucket begins to get full. And what happens with any bucket is it begins to overflow. And we use this simple analogy to show you how stress affects the body and the brain. So usually when your bucket is overflowed, it usually goes into one of three symptoms: anxiety, depression and anger. Sometimes all of the above. In fact, there are hundreds and hundreds of different symptoms. Lots of physical ailments, you could say, have attributed to lots of stress, because that's a fact. Stress compromises the immune system. Whatever genetic predisposition you've got may manifest itself if there's enough stress in the body. And stress doesn't have to be emotional. It can be environmental. It can be the foods that you eat. It can be lack of hydration. But in this, what we're dealing with at the moment is the stress that you get emotionally. So your bucket fills, all the different stresses in your life, and you'll have named them earlier on in the course, you know, all your different ones that are individual to you. Overflows into anxiety, depression or anger. And what tends to happen is people go to the doctors complaining of one of these symptoms, and they'll usually get an antidepressant or anti-anxiety drug. Imagine this bucket is a part of the brain called the amygdala, the fight or flight. And what tends to happen is all of this stress gets stored there. And if you're having good sleep, you have something called REM. And REM is basically a dustman taking all of this stress out of the brain and putting it into the intellect. But when people are depressed or anxious, they don't usually sleep. And so the dustman isn't able to kind of empty this bucket. And even if it was, the stress builds up quicker than you can release it. So what you have is you're stuck into fight or flight. So that's what the stress does to the body. You're stuck in the primitive part of the brain. You want to run, you can't think straight. And a lot of people, when they've got exams and so forth, they can't even remember their own name, never mind a question. So we have to find a way of taking all this stress out of the bucket, put it into the intellect so you can think clearly. And that's what we do. So the next part of that will be introduce you to breathing techniques to calm the mind, because once we begin to calm the mind, we can then begin to deal with not just the symptoms, but the things that are in your bucket. And as you go through this online course, one by one, we'll start to look at every individual complaint or thing that's bothering you and start to take it out of the bucket. We're going to introduce you to a healing philosophy. So a big one for most of us, if we're all honest, is forgiveness. And so years and years ago, in fact nearly 30 years ago, I had cancer when I was 26. And so I went to a yoga class and lay down on the back of this class and heard these words very clearly in my own head. And the words said, learn to forgive again and again and again. I thought, what's that supposed to mean? What does that mean? So I went in search of forgiveness for many, many years, talked to different people, even priests, and nobody could really give me a working model of what forgiveness was, because the truth was I was still angry at people and at life. So part of this search is that I understood you can't get to forgiveness if you focus on the act itself, because some things people do are absolutely crazy. They hurt people in lots of different ways. But you can get to forgiveness through compassion, and that's where the healing philosophy comes into. So I'm going to explain about how you can get to compassion and then how that leads to forgiveness itself. So the first thing in this journey, which would last about 10 years of my search for forgiveness, I watched a documentary on 3 men, and they were interviewing all their moms. Now the first man was in prison for grievous bodily harm, and he'd really beaten someone to, well, not very nice really, really laid into this man. He was in prison for this act, this crime. And at face value, you would have thought this man, there's absolutely no hope for him. And then they interviewed the mother of this man in prison. And she said when he was a young boy of about 7 years old, his best friend drowned in front of him. And from that moment on, his life was absolutely changed. And so that young boy went from a really nice kid to his life and world fell apart, led him into violence, one violent act after another. But all you saw in face value was the damage he'd done to this other man, and the end result was prison. And then he interviewed the mother of a second mum, and again she said as a young boy he was battered and beaten by his dad and locked in cupboards and all kinds of things, and up to a certain point he had a normal life. But after that everything changed, and this kid carried on this self-destruct with drugs and fighting and everything else. And again all you saw was the end result of this man in prison. And the third mother, a very, very similar story. She said even this young boy, when he was 6 years old, saw his dad on his bus and his dad completely ignored him. And all these horrendous things were done to this young boy. Can you imagine how that young boy felt? And again, this young boy perpetuated that process and just continued to fight and get into trouble. So after watching this documentary, it just started to permeate things within me, my consciousness about forgiveness. And then later on I saw an interview with a doctor who was talking to a big audience about cancer and nutrition. And after the talk, which lasted about an hour, a woman came over to the doctor afterwards and said, "You know, doctor, it was a brilliant talk, and I'm so pleased that all the things that I'm doing to help myself with cancer, you've endorsed and said it's really good, that nutrition has a really beneficial effect." And of course the doctor thanked her and she went on her way. And then 2 minutes later, a man in the same audience came up to the doctor and said, "You know, doctor, I'm so glad to hear that nutrition has no bearing on cancer at all." So it got me thinking, two people in the audience, and both heard different things through the filters and the beliefs that they'd had a long time before. Again, all these things started to permeate in my consciousness. And then one particular night, someone was taken into hospital that I loved, and I couldn't get to them. And the reason I couldn't get to them is because I was too anxious. I was too anxious to drive. I was on 160 milligrams of beta blockers, and I was too anxious to even step out the door sometimes. I had one panic attack after another. So this person was in hospital, I couldn't get to them, and I thought, what must they think of me? And so from that kind of analogy, I realised that if it's true for me, everybody does what they do because of where they are. If they knew better, they'd do better. Because I was frozen by fear. And then somebody after that asked me a question. "Stuart, have you ever hurt anyone?" And my initial reaction was no. I've never hurt anyone in my life. But of course I had. I hurt this particular person on some level who was in hospital because they thought I didn't care, but nothing could be further from the truth. So I realised if it's true for me, it's true for you. That it's true for everybody who hurt somebody else. We're all byproducts of our past. And we filter things through our perceptions based on our past. Is that true? Absolutely. So therein lies the beginning, the key to compassion. Understanding human nature, which is compassion, a deep level of understanding that everybody does what they do because of where they are. If they knew better, they'd do better, including me, including you. So I have a question. It's the same question that was asked of me, and maybe you can write this down, pause the video just for a moment and two. Have you ever hurt anyone? Have you ever hurt anyone? Think about that. Pause it. Okay, so hopefully by now you will have a list of people you've hurt. I'm not saying it's intentional, but surely on that list there's people you hurt. Why did you do what you do? Why did you do what you did? You had your reasons. Perhaps you were in a certain place in life, couldn't be bothered, you were distressed, whatever your reasons. That's the beginning of compassion, understanding human nature. Everybody does what they do because of where they are.